Hello and welcome to the India Energy Hour. I am Sandeep Pai, a former journalist with Hindustan Times and now an energy researcher at the University of British Columbia.
And I'm Shreya Jay, journalist with Business Standard newspaper in Delhi, writing on the energy sector.
Together, we are really excited to co-host a new podcast on India's energy transition, the India Energy Hour. This podcast is hosted by 101 Reporters, an innovative news agency that connects grassroots reporters and media houses to bring out untold stories. The show is produced by Tejas Dayan and Sagar of 101 Reporters.
In this podcast, we want to unpack and document India's energy transition. We will interview leading energy, development, and climate experts from academia, civil society, and the government. Through these interviews, we will explore the most pressing hurdles and promising opportunities in the energy transition unfolding in India. We will examine the role of government, finance, social justice, and science. Over time, we will feature other countries of the global south as well. More than 100 countries have pledged to get to net zero emissions in the next 30 years. There is increasing international pressure on India to join the bandwagon of countries that have declared net zero. Within India, this has sparked a deeper debate. While some groups contend that India can leapfrog and declare a net zero target by 2050, others warn that such a target will impede India's developmental needs. In our sixth episode, we asked Dr. Navroz K. Dubash whether India should declare a net zero target. Dr. Dubash is India's leading climate expert and has been a scholar, policy advisor, and an activist for over 3 decades.
Let me start by thanking you again, Navroz, for joining us. It's an absolute honor for us to have you here. Thank you. And I'm sure that you will enjoy this conversation and our audience will learn a lot. Not to mention we all as well, because we want to learn so much about this topic that has been in news and has risen up again because of the climate conference that will happen later in the year. But before we get into this interesting topic of net zero and what it means for the world, let's start with you. Let you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself. You entered into the climate and energy issues for close to some decades. And when you started researching about climate change, it was fairly a new topic, especially in India. People still do not relate with a topic called climate change. So how difficult it was then and how it became a mainstream topic and how are things now when you talk about this? And meanwhile, while you're telling, can you tell us about your journey as well?
Okay, thank you so much, Shreya, and thank you, Sandeep. I'm really delighted to be on this very exciting, relatively new podcast, though you have a lot of acceptance and followers already, which is great to see. So I don't want to bore your listeners with the journey. One of the downsides of having been around for a while is that there have been a few twists and turns in this journey. But maybe I'll give you a couple of the main points as to how I got into this. In some ways, I got into climate change in every way. In fact, I got into climate change through thinking about development. And I was actually very, very lucky. I was a student in the US, and I had to do a policy exercise. And one of the professors says, why don't we do it around climate change? So a bunch of third-year students did a policy exercise around climate change. It was relatively early. We called it the Princeton Protocol on Climate Change very grandly. And it got picked up by a couple of academic publications. And we were really excited. So we thought, okay, that's sort of fun. But that was not what actually got me really motivated. And what I did then was like many of people of my generation, I got interested in environmental issues through the Narmada Dam and the Narmada Bachao Andolan. And for my undergraduate thesis, I actually hiked through the Narmada Valley, interviewing various people, including Meda Patkar and others, kind of exploring these issues. And that was actually my passion. What is the sort of environmental development tension all about? And that's what I wanted to work on when I finished. And so I went to one of the US NGOs who had worked with the Andolan. And they said, look, we don't have a job working on all that stuff. And that stuff meaning, World Bank funding for destructive projects. But we are setting up a climate change network. And so I said, well, I have done this thing on climate change. And they said, great. We're looking for somebody to set up a global network on climate change. And I was like, well, I'm only just finished college. And they said, yeah, but we don't have much money. And so I got this incredible break where I got to coordinate what was then a nascent network on climate change, the Climate Action Network, which has now sort of grown to a very big network. Now, when I went for the job, the head of the organization said, talk to me back and forth. And he said, well, you don't seem that convinced by climate change as a problem. You keep talking about development. And I said, well, look, most of the people I'll be interacting with will be coming from the same position as me. So it's probably good that I relate to them. And he thought that was kind of a smart aleck answer. And he accepted it. The point I'm trying to make is that from these very, very, very early days, for me, climate change has always been around this tension about how do you both achieve development, understood, of course, much more broadly than growth, and how do you achieve, and how do you do that in a way that's environmentally sustainable and that is just, right? Because that's where sort of the whole Narmada question was fundamentally around justice. So those strands have been common to my work really all the way through. And perhaps the second theme common to that work is because I was coordinating this network, a lot of it was around trying to reach some kind of agreement and understanding through discussion and deliberation. So the power of stories, how do you talk about things, was something that became very clear to me early. So development, justice, narratives, these are kinds of themes from those early days that have sort of continued. And then, I wandered off and I did other things. I worked on groundwater. And around 2009, I was teaching at JNU, and I saw this kind of Bali Conference of Parties moment, this meeting in Bali in 2007. And I could see that the discussion was reaching a boil. And that's when I sort of decided to jump back in. And a couple of years later, joined CPR and have found it a very happy home. So I've stayed. So that's my effort at the journey in a bit of a nutshell.
I just have to make a point here that when I started my journalism career around 2009-10, one of my first stories was also on Narmada. So I have to tell you that story. And I also got this opportunity to travel across with Mera Patkar around Sardar Sarovar and all that. And that has also shaped my own thinking. And now I'm also, in the last few years, especially during my PhD, I've gotten into climate change related topics. But it's interesting. Hopefully I can follow your path, going forward.
And I think the Narmada Andolan has actually been really impactful on the imagination of many, many people. So for example, the Prayas Energy Group, who I work with very closely, Girish Sant, one of the founders, they got started looking at an alternative to big dams for electricity. And I ended up writing my undergraduate thesis on the Narmada as a seedbed for civil society in India. And I think that's actually is what it has been in many ways. So I think it's amazing that so many years, even though you so many years after my journey, Sandeep, is when you embarked on yours. Again, Narmada was a big part of it. I think that's fascinating.
That's great. So first of all, let's just understand what this net zero is. What does net zero target means for countries? And, we have seen countries racing each other. UK has announced a net zero target. China has announced. So what is if you can help us understand first, what does net zero target means for such countries, and why are they in a rush to announce it? And what is this whole international and global geopolitics behind this particular thing?
Sure, happy to get into that, Shreya. If you don't mind, can I start by because I'm sure we're going to come to how India approaches this, but it might be worth taking a minute to look at kind of the Indian story and why, what the context is for net zero. So if I could just sort of say that, as many of your listeners will know, for practically 2 decades, India's story, with a lot of justification around climate change, was we weren't in the forefront of causing this problem. We're a poor country. We shouldn't be asked to be in the lead in solving it. So the equity narrative, very strongly developed by CSE and others, and the argument that we need some space to grow, particularly at a time when the cheapest power available was coal-based power. Right? So that was the sort of historical story. Around 2007, 2009, as I said, this moment around the Bali Action Plan, the Copenhagen Climate Parties in 2009, with these I'm referring to these big negotiating meetings. We felt the sort of pressure we're feeling now, diplomatically, and the response was a little bit to mimic China, which had just created a national action plan. And in academic literature, one talks about performative institutions, institutions that are built to kind of perform a role, to perform to literally perform rather than do anything substantive. And I think many people thought our national action plan would be one of these. But surprisingly, the National Action Plan introduced language, which some of us in academia have been talking about, the language of co-benefits. That look, there's a lot of good that can happen to India in terms of development, and this comes back to the development climate linkage. In terms of development, by doing things that are also good for mitigation. Now, we may do them for development reasons, but let's keep one eye on their mitigation gains. And so, investing in public transport, thinking ahead and beginning to experiment with solar power. Investing in energy efficiency is a no-brainer. Right? Energy efficiency is a cheaper way of generating power than building a new power plant. Right? By reducing, by increasing the efficiency of your use, you're effectively doing the same thing as generating more electrons. So all of these things, it kind of opened the door to all of these things. And we actually did quite a lot, and it allowed us over time to sort of shift the perception of India on the global stage. So I think that's that. So that co-benefits development pathway sort of language, which said, okay, India needs to grow, but we need to grow smarter, was language that worked. And it helped move things, maybe certainly not as far as they could have gone, but substantially. And it helped shift perceptions. So that's now that's the context that we're in now, where in India, many people have approached this year thinking we're looking pretty good. And part of the reason we're looking pretty good globally is the rest of the world has moved backwards. You have people like Mr. Trump, you have people like Mr. Bolsonaro, you have Scott Morrison in Australia, and they're all moving backwards. So for the last few years, India has actually not moved forward that much, but just by staying in place, we've become a leader. Right? This is the context for net zero. And so let me start by saying what the political context is for net zero. The political context is a global community that would like to jumpstart the momentum after 4 years of Trump. A Biden administration that has made climate change extremely high on its foreign policy priority list, one of its main 4 priorities for its administration. And the need to demonstrate a break with the past. And net zero diplomatically has become an important narrative to do that. Net zero has the backing of the IPCC, because the IPCC 1.5 report, the report that said, how do we get to 1.5 degrees, which is a much more ambitious target than 2 degrees. And some people wonder whether it's even still within reach. They said, and this is where the scientific, the definitive framing of the issue comes in. They said that to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, we have to, as a global community, reach net zero emissions by 2050. And net zero meaning that the sum of emissions minus uptake or sinks has to be net zero. And I believe they were talking in terms of net zero carbon, right? Not greenhouse gases. So that is what the IPCC 1.5 report said. Now, this was a more stringent formulation than the Paris Agreement, which said by the second half of the century, emissions and sinks have to be in balance. So this fast forwarded that to 2050. Right? So now you had a very clear articulation of what was needed globally. And the question really becomes, what do various countries have to do to get there? Now, the challenge is that the Paris Agreement reached, we managed to get agreement around Paris by developing this construct called nationally determined contributions. nationally determined contributions, which meant every country would do what it felt it could manage to do, which is a very different construct from earlier negotiations, which said, here's where we have to get to globally, let's divide up the pie. Right? So now the question is, if you have nationally determined contributions, the understanding was each country could do as much as they could do, but a net zero construct essentially says, because you have a global limit, which is we have to globally get to net zero by 2050, if a certain number of countries say, we will get to net zero by 2050, the only way for us all to get to net zero by 2050 is if the rest of the countries also agree to the same thing. Right? So everyone essentially has to do the same thing unless some countries do get to net zero faster and create space for other countries to get to net zero later. So this argument essentially pancakes a key idea in global negotiations, which is the idea of common but differentiated responsibility and respective capabilities. It's a mouthful, but if anybody works on climate change, unfortunately, we have to know this acronym, CBDRRC, right? And it basically says that some countries, because we're starting at a later date, because you're poorer, because you haven't contributed as much to the problem, get to go a little bit later. And that is kind of an accepted principle. It's in the Paris Agreement too, because it says some countries peak later. So that is why net zero, in a sense, is a potential shift in the narrative. And it's one reason why I think there's been a lot of debate around it. I want to be clear. I think it's actually a useful and constructive idea. As I've said from the start of this podcast, narratives have a lot of power. And the idea that we don't just have to slow down, don't just have to limit, but we actually have to go to zero is an important message to get across. But I think we have to, unfortunately, nuance it by saying who does how much, by when, at what cost. We can't avoid those more complex second-order debates. And that's where we are right now.
Great. I think that's a really great summary of, all the negotiations and how we have reached here. So one of the things that I do in my PhD is I look at some of the models. I'm working with one of the IPCC models, which model, and I mean, for any country for that matter, like UK or Canada, net zero basically involves lots of offsets, lots of carbon capture and storage, lots of other negative emissions technologies, which are not currently very costly and underdeveloped. So, I mean, even for 1 minute, let's forget about India, but are these net zero targets even realistic, even for the rich countries, be it Canada, UK, or any other country?
So I think so I was part of the IPCC AR5, and I'm part of the IPCC for AR6, which is the fifth and sixth assessment reports. Fifth one came out 2012. The next one will come out next year. And the IPCC AR5 was criticized for a lot of its scenarios relying quite heavily on so-called negative emissions technologies. And I think it is true that at the moment, we don't have a great pathway to negative emissions. One of the critiques of net zero has been that by introducing the word net and by not unbundling how much you do through emissions reductions and how much you do through sinks, you are indirectly encouraging complacency about the need to do more on emissions earlier. So one of the problems of the net zero formulation is that it doesn't unpackage how much a country is going to do by limiting emissions and how much it's going to do by enhancing sinks or uptakes of carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases. And so the risk is that it implicitly sends a signal to countries that they have an option down the road and they may not need to prioritize as much reducing emissions in the short run. And I think that's a dangerous signal. So many have said, there's a good paper, for example, in Nature just last week by a few authors. Many have said, look, we need to have a net zero target that also tells us how you're going to get there, so we can assess whether or not there's enough attention being paid to upfront emissions and not just displacing or pushing back to the future. I think there's a growing sense that we really will have to put sinks on the table and start thinking about not just the technology implications, but also the governance implications of those sinks, because some of the ideas for geoengineering might have all kinds of other spillover effects and complications and so on and so forth. Start messing with the oceans, start messing with solar radiation and so on. So I think it's probably useful to start having that conversation. But there is an even larger conversation, which is, should we now declare that 1.5 degrees is out of reach and try and make sure we get to 2 degrees at minimum? And here, again, there's a debate. Some people feel that we need to, if you put 1.5 on the table, you will place kind of political stress on the system, which will react by moving faster. Other people, and I put myself in this camp, say we have to be a little careful about not overstressing the system. So the Paris Agreement is built around a ratchet mechanism, which means these NDCs I talked about earlier, countries put them on the table, they make a good faith effort to implement them. Hopefully, through learning by doing, they will find it's not that costly to do greenhouse gas mitigation, and they will be encouraged to up their target the next time around. Right? But you have to have that learning by doing process. If you jumpstart that and ask a country to make a pledge beyond which it thinks it can reasonably achieve, then you might get back into the dynamic pre-Paris of countries kind of arguing with each other over what is called burden sharing. Who bears the burden? So Paris sort of shifted the language into an opportunity creating language, but we might flip back into a burden sharing language if we're not careful. So in other words, I think many systems don't react linearly. We know that technology adoption doesn't react linearly. There's kind of an S-curve. And political systems, there's no reason political systems will react linearly. The more pressure you apply at one end, the more sausage you get out at the other end. That's not necessarily the case. Right? So I think we have to, we're engaged in sort of a complicated set of questions around this.
If I may just intervene there, you interestingly mentioned about burden sharing that the Paris Agreement paved way for. But these climate conferences for years, and we have seen, in pre-Trump era as well, and also post-Trump, that a lot of blame game happens. And here I would like to point out to a very interesting event that I witnessed just yesterday. There was a ministerial conference that COP had hosted yesterday, in which we had energy and climate ministers across the world, including from India. And a very interesting statement was made by R.K. Singh, who happens to have the charge of power and renewable energy. And he said, the 80% of the carbon budget is has been taken away by the developed countries, and developing countries, especially Africa, do not have that kind of space to grow. These are the countries that are now growing, and they would need steel, cement, coal, and they want that space. So why are we suddenly expecting them to use hydrogen, to use carbon cleaning technology? He did not mention India. That was the most interesting part. He said India has a lot of money and we will have 500 gigawatt of renewable energy by 2030. That's another point of discussion. But then there were a lot of points made by a lot of developing countries. So there were ministers who said, these countries have the opportunity now to not engage with fossil fuel and then directly move to green hydrogen and greener fuels and biomass and everything. Something that didn't go well with a couple of African countries. So do you think with now the dialogue starting at the beginning of the year, by the time we reach to the climate conference, when the actual engagement happens, will we see a lot of this blame game happening? And do you really think, my question actually is, do you really think that there is a sane way for these countries to, come together and discuss?
So a very good and a very big question, Shreya. As I said, I hinted in my earlier response that there's a possibility that we might flip back to kind of a burden sharing story. And if there's one thing I've become convinced of, narratives are really, really important in this whole process. And narratives are underpinned by models, but the models are only kind of we have to use these models as a way of having conversations rather than taking them as absolute. So it is interesting that India has and Minister R.K. Singh has made a case in terms of African development needs rather than Indian development needs. It's a little bit from the Chinese playbook, because China has always sort of talked about positioned itself as a champion of the group of 77 developing countries and so on and so forth, and said, look, we're doing pretty well, but we have to look out for poorer countries. So here's my take on this. I find myself in a very awkward position these days. I've spent most of my working life urging India to not look at climate change only as a constraint, but look at it as a possible door opener to better development pathways and practices. We want to build better cities. Better cities are also likely to be lower greenhouse gas cities, less congested, more public transport and so on. They're also likely to be cities with cleaner air. I think there's a lot of scope for that conversation. So I've always been a little uncomfortable with the common but differentiated responsibility principle, which is the articulation of what you just mentioned, R.K. Singh said. That is the kind of the core principle that backs that point, right? That we need more space and time. I've been a little uncomfortable with it as a hard principle, as a principle that allows you to say, we need a certain fixed share of a carbon budget. Because in a sense, suppose we were to win that argument, right? And we were to say, okay, India, we're, say, an eighth, whatever we are now, a seventh of the global population. We need a seventh of the carbon budget totally, which means we get an even larger share of the future budget because we haven't used up our share. And we get this enormous carbon budget. Would India want to use that carbon budget? Because if we did, we are already the most air polluted country in the world. We would actually be twice as polluted as other countries. Would we want to use all that carbon budget? Because if we did, we would be a coal-dependent economy, which means that by 2030, 2040, 2050, we would also be a technologically backward economy, because the rest of the world is certainly moving to renewable energy. So we don't necessarily want a hard allocation of all of that carbon. What we want is a little bit of a hedge. So CBDR, RC, common but differentiated responsibility, is useful to us because we have to basically say, we're going to try mightily to do what all these Europeans tell us. So they say you need to leapfrog. I think a better analog is actually that you have to tunnel through. Leapfrog sounds like something instantaneous. Tunneling through is actually a hard process. You have to tunnel through an emissions peak. So you actually achieve development with lower carbon. That's actually hard. Tunneling is hard, right? Leapfrog requires a sudden burst of energy and then you're done. That's not a great metaphor, actually, for what we have in front of us. But we're going to try. But if it's harder than we think, if the support isn't as forthcoming as we hope, if we are risking placing the poor at the front lines of the mitigation challenge, then we want to be able to use a bit more carbon, and we'd ask you to use a bit less. That is where I think the differentiation argument comes in. So in a sense, I don't agree either with R.K. Singh nor with the Europeans. We have to find a middle path here. We have to say we are being ambitious. And this is where my personal pushback against net zero comes in. And I have colleagues saying, look, you've been doing this for the longest time. Now that you have a really ambitious prospect for India to be truly ambitious and agree to reach for the stars, why are you urging a circumspection? And my answer is, I'm not sure that for India, it comes back to all that Narmada story I told you about. I'm not sure that for India, telling a story about mitigation as the primary driver of our governance system will work. We don't vote around climate change in India. It's not at the top of people's minds. Agriculture and agricultural impacts, yes. Droughts, yes. Floods and storms, yes. Crowded cities, certainly. But not mitigation as mitigation. So India needs to be thinking about a low carbon development path that is aimed at tunneling through. But I would say for us to project where we will be exactly in 2050 is much, much harder to do. Because for a country that is growing as fast as India is, and that is going through the transitions we're going through an urbanization transition, we're going through an infrastructure transition, we have vast populations moving from rural areas to urban areas, we have this enormous migrant population that came into focus during the lockdown, and we're going through a demographic transition. What that means for a future India is really unclear. And so actually, part of what I've been doing is pushing back against models. Because models do mitigation scenarios. We actually need to think in terms of scenarios about different future Indias. Right? Are we going to be more like South Korea, an export-led economy? Perhaps not. Are we going to be a services-led economy with mega cities? Are we going to be a services-led economy driven by digitalization, where in fact you don't have urbanization because people stay in second and third tier cities, and so you have different patterns of urbanization? All of these things will affect our mitigation patterns, and there are many possible futures. Right? So asking India to commit to a net zero target is also asking India to commit to a development future, because we haven't sorted that out yet. So it's a much, much bigger ask. And partly I fault the West here, because in a sense, they're not taking yes for an answer. India has actually said, we are going to try really hard to build a low carbon future. And they said, no, not good enough, give us net zero. And this is for a country where emission levels are a third the global average. So I think that we have to have a conversation where the West has to actually have a reasonable ask, because and India has to have a better answer as well.
Right. I really, wow, there's so much to unpack there. And I really like your middle ground between, on the one end of the spectrum is a hard CBDR, and on the other end of the spectrum are groups that talk about leapfrogging. So I really like your analogy about like tunneling through. But let's say if I were to push back on that point, just for the argument's sake, I mean, you said that, India, what if India doesn't use that carbon budget, right? But India can ask for that carbon budget and then not use it. And that's a good thing, right? Like if the rest of the world, for example, in vacuum, meets all its targets and India has more budget and India doesn't use that budget, isn't that a good thing? I mean, just your reaction. That's just probably just to push you on and get more insights about this topic.
No, sure. Look, everything else being equal, sure. Ask for a carbon budget if you think you can get it. But we are not just looking at climate change as an isolated negotiation, right? We are looking at climate change as a negotiation as part of a larger foreign policy positioning of this government, including, very importantly, a foreign policy positioning with an incoming Biden administration. Let's look at the context, right? There's a geopolitical context within which these things happen. So let me look at. There's two reasons. Let me back up. So before I get to the diplomatic reason, I guess the point I would make is asking for our full fair share, quote unquote, of the carbon budget, right, has two problems. One is every country has a calculation for what is a fair share, and lo and behold, each country's calculation favors them. So a decade ago, the basic countries, Brazil, South Africa, India, and China, had a joint publication on allocation of the carbon budget. And China's allocation gave China a lot, India's allocation gave India a lot, South Africa's allocation gave South Africa a lot, Brazil's allocation gave Brazil a lot. Right? And each of them was justifiable. Interestingly, all of them gave India a lot, because India is objectively poorer and objectively further behind and objectively has contributed less. So yes, we are in a good position conceptually to argue for this. But it is not costless to argue for this. So why would you want to expend diplomatic goodwill on something that you're really sure you don't want to use, unless you have to? Because it is not just about climate negotiations. So that comes to the diplomatic point, right? We have a government that is very keen to shift India's image in the world on climate change. We've gone through a decade really where India was seen as the naysayer, and there's this very memorable New York Times cartoon of a sleepy-looking Indian elephant lying across a railroad track with a Paris train kind of coming down the track. That's the image that this government has wanted to shed And to be honest, I've been glad that they shared that image because we have a lot to actually put out there. But let's look at the geopolitical context, as I was saying. We have just joined, so we have regional tensions with China, who are our partners in BASIC. We have just joined the Quad, the group of Australia, Japan, US, and India, which does security exercises in the Pacific, and so on. It was seen as a much closer alignment with the US than in the past. In the past, we haven't actually sort of stepped into the Quad in this sort of way. In this larger context, right? We are angling for a Security Council seat, have been doing so for a long time. In this larger context, why expend diplomatic capital for something that you don't think you really want to use? And I think the most powerful argument is we do want to induce technological change in India. We do want to send signals to industry. So the votaries of net zero in India kind of go, I think, to the extreme, where they say that just by setting a net zero target, you will automatically send a signal of credibility. Money will flow. Industries will flock to net zero technologies, and we will dramatically change. And I think that ignores a little bit the way in which change happens in India. So let me give you an example. Around Copenhagen, as I said, we created this performative institution of the National Action Plan. And these missions, the solar mission, energy efficiency mission, many of them did very little, partly because they were not constructed in ways that were suitable to missions. I mean, how do you have a water mission when water is urban use, groundwater, large dams, hydropower projects, etc., etc., etc.? It's too big, and it wasn't focused enough. But the solar and energy efficiency missions were focused and led to a lot of transformative change because enterprising bureaucrats could drive that change. Right? Fast forward to 2015, India set an NDC, a National Determined Contribution, with 3 quantitative elements. An intensity target that our emissions would the carbon intensity of our GDP would decline by 33 to 35% from 2005 levels by 2030. So we would basically become a more carbon efficient economy. We set a renewable energy target, and we set a forest sequestration target. I'm not sure a single thing has changed on the ground as a result of those 3 NDC targets. Because our approach has been to set targets that are actually short of what we want to do domestically. So our strategy has been to set conservative targets and overachieve them. But more importantly, we don't have any mechanism to translate those targets into actions. There has been conversation about building a Paris implementation mechanism for the last 5 years since Paris. Finally, an Apex committee on Paris implementation has been set up. It still hasn't met, to the best of my knowledge. Right? And it's just one more joint secretary committee. So we don't have a bureaucratic mechanism to translate visions of the future into the present, which I think is actually a really big issue. So I've sort of gone quite far from your question, Sandeep, but I would like to come back to this because I think that this question of building an institutional structure would actually be a really good thing for India to do, and is something we should be asking other countries to do. Because in some research that is coming out shortly, we looked at 8 major economies, and only a couple of them even had mechanisms like this. Right? So we have to build a more climate-friendly state, is what I'm saying. We're not going to bring about a transition like this without the state, which is not to say that it's only going to be the state. There's lots of other things going on at cities, communities, which are fabulous and need to be encouraged. But we also need the state. So that's another sort of line of questioning that we should perhaps come back to at some point.
I have one more really interesting follow-up. I just wanted to pick up on your point about there's obviously some people in India who argue for net zero, and they, as you articulated, they say that would attract different investments and, it will set the ball rolling and stuff like that. Let's say in a hypothetical world, and perhaps it seems from yesterday's event that India may not declare, although we don't know, different people are saying different things. Let's say India were to declare net zero by 2050 or 2047, as there's some people saying 100 years of, um, so if that were to happen, how could it impact, the domestic politics? One has to understand that states may not be ready for the state governments. Center may be, but are the state governments ready to achieve this? So I'm wondering if um, India should even declare that, and if it declares, what would be the domestic implications? You can think about it either in terms of center state or coal regions versus non-coal regions, or you can slice it in whatever way you want. But any sense of how that could look like?
If I may add, the state governments, along with them, the PSUs as well, are they ready?
Right, right. No, very good questions. So first, let me just, I think it's essential to ask the question about the states. But first, let's just pause and say, do we know if India is ready at the center? Does the center have a good enough question for this? And the only way we have of knowing this stuff is models. And we don't have great models. One of the things, in terms of my institutional point that I was making earlier, is every time India has to come up with a pledge, we contract out to a couple of research institutes and say, can you please do a quick study for us? They don't get much time to do it. There's no peer review of it. It's closed door. It's non-transparent. And then 4 or 5 years later, a different group will do a different study with a different set of assumptions. There's no comparability. So we have to have some better way of knowing this. We need to build that into what we do. But based on what we do know from the models that are out there right now, 3 different models basically say that India has to peak its emissions. And here's another important point, right? Logically, prior to getting to net zero, is we have to say when we're going to peak, when we're going to actually turn the corner. So the models that are out there now say India has to peak either 0 years from now, in other words, we've already peaked, 5 years from now, or 10 years from now. These are this is the range of the very few models that are out there explicitly asking this question, which would mean that India would have to peak at a per capita emissions less than 3 tons per capita, which is less than half the global average. China is about 8, the US is about 15. Right? So we would have to peak at 1/5 the US emissions. Now, maybe we can do that. Maybe we can squeeze a lot of development out of less carbon. But maybe we can't. We just don't know. And so my own view is that let's aspire to something that says, sure, we're aiming in the net zero direction. But let's not lock ourselves in, because it risks placing the burden on the back of the poor. So I would. But I think that the problem is that to simultaneously push back against net zero at the same time as appearing ambitious, because that is the diplomatic order of the day, right? And let's be clear about the scale of the diplomatic challenge in front of India. 120 countries have declared net zero targets. I think all of the top 10 emitters have declared net zero targets, except for the US, and they are expected to on April 22nd when there's a summit in the US. India will be the only country without one. So the scale of the pressure is enormous. We are also the poorest country in that mix. So maybe we have a reason. But I think we have to have a counter story. Those of us who are saying be careful about net zero, it's incumbent on us to have a counter story, right? And we're actively working on developing that. And I'm happy to talk about that if that's of use. But let me come to your question about the states. Way back when, a little anecdote to give an indication of how the government thinks about this. Back when the states were doing state action plans. So in 2012, states were asked to do state action plans with the promise of money from the Planning Commission on the table. There was a low carbon group set up that I was part of to do the analysis, to sort of set the stage for what India would do in the future. This was when Mr. Jairam Ramesh was Environment Minister. And when the template for those plans was sent to states, they were more or less told, please don't do any greenhouse gas accounting, right? Make these about adaptation. Don't even count your emissions very carefully, because there was an enormous fear in the ministry that having to allocate and emissions targets, two states, would raise such a political, it would be such a political hairball. It would be so hard to have that negotiation in India's quite fractious federalism. And I think that would be right. And it'd be, so for example, Belgium, which has 3 provinces, took, I think, 3 or 4 years to allocate emissions targets among its 3 provinces. And it's a relatively homogenous country compared to India, economically and socially homogenous. So there is a real question here about if you have a hard quantitative cap on emissions, how on earth do you allocate that? How on earth do you allocate that? So it is an unasked and unanswered question. In terms of the PSUs, well, I guess, unlike China's PSUs, which seem to have some independent political power, I'm not sure ours have that much clout in the same way. I'm guessing that they could be brought into line because their financing is dependent on government or banks and so on. So there's probably points of leverage on the PSUs, but certainly on the states, I think it's a much harder question. So there are huge implementation challenges. I think we have to be a little cautious about the somewhat sanguine, we'll set the target, we'll suddenly become international darlings, we'll become super competitive, money will flow, and this transformation will happen faster. I think transformations happen when you identify roadblocks to those transformations and you deliberately dilute them or erode them, and you figure out how to build coalitions, how to support technology, how to shift institutions. Let me make a broader point. We wrote an article in a new journal called the India Forum, basically making the argument with regard to the energy system that ideas, interests, and institutions tend to lock in around one configuration. And if you want to move to another configuration, so from coal-fired power plants to renewable energy, all 3 of those things have to change. So the ideas around what constitutes power, right? The fact that centralized power is always more reliable and so on and so forth. The interests, so instead of coal interests, you have to think about renewable energy interests. You have to think about providers of raw materials for solar panels and so on. And critically, the institutions, which at the moment are centralized power providers and distribution companies, which are quite flawed in many ways. And you have to shake all 3 of those things loose and get to a new, more stable equilibrium. And you have to do that in sector after sector, which is why I feel that India should be talking about a sector-by-sector transition story. I think that's a much more powerful way of talking about it, and we can aspire to what it adds up to in the future, and we can keep revising that. So that's the way I find it more constructive to think about it. In other words, it comes back to the point, again, at the beginning. We have to think about doing development differently. We shouldn't be thinking about mitigation as a starting point. We have to think about mitigation as the outcome of doing development differently.
Okay. So, I'm just unpacking some of your ideas, but first of all, I would like to know the narrative, because, you're really talking about taking a middle ground, not the CBDR, let's say, I would call it like the hard CBDR, or the second is the really techno-economic modeling based net zero targets. I don't know any model that can incorporate political, social, these days jobs have become a proxy for social sort of like outcomes, but we know how job calculations are done. But anyway, so I really like that you're taking this sort of more pragmatic, if I can call it like middle ground. On the one end of the spectrum are many people in India, you see on Twitter and otherwise, who are saying that, look, how can we, right? Like, we have not emitted in the past. How can we write off historic emissions of rich countries? We cannot declare net zero and so on. But on the other end of the spectrum are some of the studies and the models that you're talking about, which are primarily techno-economic models, least cost techno-economic models. And they have some social component, but it's basically jobs as a proxy, or healthy air as a proxy, but they're not able to capture, and it's hard to capture the nuances of, the intricacies of politics and state center, and so on. So, I mean, I really like that you're taking the middle ground here, that, we have to kind of be ambitious, but we have to be careful as well. So I would love for you to expand on that narrative. What are your thoughts? How should India approach, the next few months and till we reach Glasgow, and what should be our stand?
Okay, great. So first of all, I think that I would like to project the way I think about this as a conceptual middle ground, but reject the idea of middle as being middle of the road and pragmatic. It's because I am actually not sure it is. The hard differentiation, let's grab all the carbon budget, basically ignores the fact that the world is changing and that we don't want to be left behind. The let's commit to net zero, of course, exposes India to huge risk. And so in that sense, walking back from that is a middle ground and caution. But I actually think that for some of the reasons we've discussed, it isn't actually the most ambitious view out there, because it rests on that dodge in not being specific about sources versus sinks, right? And it doesn't tell us much about what we have to do today. So I would actually say, and I've heard sort of informal comments where people say, okay, India comes up with a net zero by 2050 target. Does that mean we don't build more coal-fired power plants today? Not necessarily, because that's 2050, and we always have sinks, right? So I'm not even sure that is particularly that will open the door to more aggressive action. I actually feel this conceptual middle ground is conceptually middle in that it takes seriously how India actually works and the politics and institutions that drive change. It's conceptually middle in that sense, but it is potentially more ambitious than a net zero target, because I think it'll move us further, faster, and critically with a bigger political tent. More people will be on board. And I think one thing that we've learned that is that even when a government has a massive majority like this government does, there are limits to what it can push through, as we've seen with the farmer issue and so on. So simply by saying, so even this government, I think if it agrees to a net zero target and says, we are going to reformulate Indian governance to privilege mitigation, because that is what some of the ideas out there would say, right? Let's have a body that sets mitigation targets for every ministry. You would be privileging mitigation over everything else each of those ministries has to do. Would that actually fly in the bureaucracy and with the citizenry? I just don't think we have a political consensus around that, right? And history and country after country's experience shows that when you have your institutions structured in a way that outreach your political agreement, they founder. Right? So I would resist the idea that what I'm saying is pragmatic and therefore boring and safe. I actually think it is the pathway to more ambition. But let me spell out what I think we should do. It's really 3 or 4 steps. I think that we have to have conversations, as I said, around sector transitions that are already underway, keeping in mind which parts of our economy are the most important from a mitigation point of view, which is not to say, again, that they're mitigation driven. They're driven by multiple objectives and multiple metrics. We have to create jobs. We have to address air pollution. We have to ensure energy access to the poor. We have to have adequate energy for growth and manufacturing and job creation. And we have to do some mitigation, right? So we need to look at how we bring about a decarbonized electricity sector. I think that is the sector that is furthest down the road of transition. We have to think about, and I think the framing is very important, how we maximize transport services per unit carbon. And I use that phrase very carefully, transport services per unit carbon, because it means that some countries or some states or some cities or some jurisdictions might try to do EVs, electric vehicles, because that is low carbon per passenger mile traveled. Some may say, no, we want to have walking pathways and bike tracks or public transport, which is also low carbon, but in a different way. Right? The point is you're moving to mobility services, not just a particular technology like EVs. We need to ultimately get to the so-called hard-to-abate sectors like industry, so energy for industrial processes, where we don't have a very good sense of technologies right now. And that's an area where we should be really prioritizing international cooperation, joint development of technology, financial transfers, and so on. We may think about a good tunneling through exercise would actually be moving straight from biomass-based cooking, kind of bypassing the current gas-based cooking, going to electric induction cooking while you decarbonize, right? So you're not locking into a gas economy, which is cleaner, certainly, than a biomass economy in terms of local air pollution and so on. But it locks us into future emissions. Maybe we can think about that. I haven't studied that, but it's the kind of idea we should be talking about. So if we build those narratives, right, I have become convinced that change happens when epistemic communities with a shared understanding of knowledge, get together, shift their language, and as part of that process of driving, as I said, ideas, interests, and institutional change, all three together. And that best happens when you break the problem up a little bit. Taking a whole economy and saying we're going to think about making this whole economy net zero at a pace faster than has ever happened in history by some margin is not a great way of structuring a conversation, right? So I think that is we have and our record shows that we can make progress when we break things up into smaller pieces. And we do have bureaucracies that work in silos. We need to start breaking the silos, right? But you want to break adjacent silos, 2 or 3 at a time. You can't knock down the whole lot at one go, right? So I think we have to think about the governance of this. And every country is going to have a different pathway. In European countries, net zero is a very powerful narrative to drive their emissions that have already peaked down towards zero. Right? Our emissions haven't peaked. It's a completely different context for a country that is still trying to provide energy services to most of its population. Our job is to bring the peak forward and peak at a lower level. We have to have a different conversation for that than a net zero conversation. So in that sense, I find what I'm proposing actually more productive and potentially more ambitious than net zero.
Maybe I use the word pragmatic. I guess if pragmatic is not the word, but I mean, I'm like, what I like is that it's sort of embedded in the realities of what best we can do. I mean, it came across as
I'm much more comfortable with that.
Yeah.
But I should actually add. You asked me a bigger question, and I only gave you a portion of the answer. So I think the sectoral piece to me is what really drives the momentum. The second piece is we have to have institutions that are more robust, that can drive and sustain this conversation over time. And these are not just governmental institutions. These are also analytical, and these are also deliberative, right? And I can talk about that. And the third piece, I want to make clear that I'm not against long-term emission targets. We have an obligation to the world to tell them where we think we're going and what we can contribute. So we should say that, right? We could enhance our intensity target. We could pledge to a direction of travel towards net zero. I just don't think we know enough to say by when we will get there, right? So I'm not saying that we shouldn't talk in mitigation terms, but we should structure our domestic conversation to continually and productively move back and forth between development and mitigation, and keep adding up and keep refining what it means for mitigation and over what time frame. Right? So that's so I just want to be very clear. I'm not saying we should not say anything about what we add or what we will contribute to the global mitigation scenario, and we must do our best to add as much as we can. But I think this is the most productive way to do that.
I'd now like to add one more jargon to this conversation. We have been talking about net zero, but if India declares a net zero, it will have its own sets of it will have its own set of issues. We will have to dial down our whole plan of adding fossil fuel capacity. That means saying goodbye to the mines. That Coal India is coming up, thermal power plants that NTPC is planning, and several other things, along with whatever renewable capacity and electric mobility that we are building. So there's this new concept that even India talked about in the yesterday's conference of COP26 that I mentioned, is the net negative emission, that you absorb the emission from the atmosphere rather than controlling the emissions that you do. And as far as I understand, it's only Bhutan which has a net negative emission. What do you think of this concept? Is it workable? Is it, as you mentioned, a pragmatic idea to propose?
Well, I think it comes back to Sandeep's earlier question, which is how far along are these so-called negative emissions technologies, right? So the assumption is that in most countries, we have to do both things, right? We have to reduce our emissions and we have to enhance our sinks. And if you can enhance your sinks to the point where they are greater than your emissions, then you are net negative, just arithmetically, right? And it basically, right now, the most common technology for enhancing sinks is simply expanding forest sequestration, in some agricultural practices and so on. So your ability to do that really depends on land and how densely populated you are. And also, if it's going to be more than your emissions, then the expectation is your emissions are not very high. So it typically will be hard to do if you're an industrialized country. Right? You can imagine a country like Germany or China, very hard for them to actually end up being negative in the near future. The argument is that in the second half of this century, more and more countries are going to have to get there. And there's an unanswered, well, it's an asked question now, but it's an unanswered question about whether other technologies will emerge that create the option of taking up carbon in ways that are more effective and that require less land than just growing more trees, right? And I think some of the oil and gas majors are beginning to start thinking about this very seriously as a new sort of area for industrial technology development.
That's really great. I think I can ask one last question. I know I want to be mindful of your time. So, I mean, India will go to COP at Glasgow in the next 6 months, I think, or so. What would be the 5 or 6 things, or you can say 3 also, that's fine. 3 to 5 things that India should really emphasize on. And I know that some of this you have covered in your previous answers, but like that, what would be the 3 or 4 takeaways that our policymakers could emphasize in the COP?
One of the ill-kept secrets of COP is that most of the action actually happens long before the delegates show up. And this COP in particular, because the US is being so proactive diplomatically, some people are even asking what is left to discuss at COP. So in the case of the Copenhagen Agreement or the Paris Agreement, there was actually text, the contours of which were set beforehand. But there was a lot of details still to be nailed down at the COP itself. This time, the game in town is asking countries to upgrade their NDCs, which really is something that is expected to happen well before COP. And India is getting better at this, but one of the problems is that we often only start paying attention closer to COP. And so the way this game is played is you have to as a country, you have to lay the groundwork for your position painstakingly over a year or two prior, right? Let's just take the example of China and the US. 1 full year before Paris, China and the US had a joint statement, right? And I'm going to get into a little bit of arcana here. They had a joint statement where they said that the two countries agreed that what was really important for climate change was, in fact, common but differentiated responsibility, right? This is the principle I talked about earlier. it was a huge sticking point in the US, because in the US Senate said, why should we do something if China doesn't? And this CBDR idea was the articulation of difference between countries. The Senate said there should be no difference between countries. So what was the resolution? That joint declaration said, common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities in light of changing economic circumstances. And that in light of changing economic circumstances basically said that as countries develop, they move from one category to another, and they can choose to make that move. China was signaling it had chosen to make that move. And that created the political negotiating space for for Paris. And it happened a year before Paris, right? So where India needs to really pick up the pace is, we've already locked ourselves in a little bit. Because before we were asked to come up with a net zero target, we had to really put out a narrative that said, for a country like India, where emissions are increasing, our version of ambition will look different. We're not trying to be unambitious. We are being ambitious. And in fact, by doing things in the short term, we are avoiding lock into a high carbon future. It's more important that India doesn't lock into more coal now than talk about what it's going to do in 2050. For the world, it's more important. Right? We have a story about how we can be very, very ambitious. But we have to tell that story so that the benchmark for success for India is that story and not somebody else's story. So in fact, the most important thing we still have to do is to lay that groundwork and talk about what the benchmarks of success are for a rapidly emerging, emissions growing, developing economy. And so I think that's a really important thing we have to do. Second, I think we have to think about 2 or 3 things that are, the criticism of the sort of argument I've been laying out, which is we talk about development futures in transport, electricity. It sounds a little waffly. At the end of the day, what exactly is India doing? We have to underpin that with 2 or 3 hard things. And something that we should really think about putting on the table is whether or not we have reached the point, and I don't want to commit to this here because analytically I don't know, but we should ask this question analytically. Do we need to build any more coal-fired power plants than are currently in the pipeline? And I think we are pretty close to not needing new coal capacity. And the financial sector isn't interested in financing new coal-fired power capacity. But peak coal capacity in India would be a powerful statement. It would be concrete. Right? We need to put a couple of things like that on the table. We need to do our homework on that. And the third thing we need to do, which I think is really, really important, is, as I said, fix our governance structure. And if we can fix it by passing a new law, but a carefully phrased, nuanced law, not one. So the laws that have been put on the table so far are cut and paste versions of the UK and New Zealand. We can't have a cut and paste law. We need to have a law that brings about these development transitions I'm talking about. And as I said, within a week or 2 weeks, hopefully CPR will have a proposal, my organization will have a proposal on the table as to how we do that. But that would be a really, really strong statement. So I think with all those things, we are then in a position to ask for something. At the moment, we're not in much of a position to ask for something. One line of argument goes, sure, India will say net zero as long as we get a big enough price. I don't actually see a price big enough to justify us leaping into a net zero target without knowing how much energy, how much carbon, and by when we can get there. I don't see a price big enough, frankly. I think that line of argumentation, which is we should be setting ourselves up for a tough bargain, I think that's actually short-sighted. You need to have enough information about your future before you gamble it away. I don't think we should be opening that door, frankly. But I do think that we have to lay the groundwork so that we can actually make changes in our economy, get diplomatic credit for it, project ourselves as ambitious, and call other countries on the mat. to basically turn this around and say, we don't think that you guys telling us what a net zero target in 2050, that you are committing to a net zero target in 2050 is good enough. Tell us what you'll do tomorrow. Tell us what you'll do the day after tomorrow. And make that hard. The US is probably going to do a net zero pledge, but it's not going to be legislative. What guarantee do we have that in 4 years, if and when the Republicans come back to the power, we're not back, if not as in a situation as bad as when Mr. Trump was in power, then still pretty bad. Why aren't we asking for firmer things from the rest of the world? But I think we have to do that from a position of strength.
Let me just quickly ask one question, slightly controversial as well. You're talking about that India should have a strong position. For the past 5-6 years, we have been announcing, a lot of ambitious targets, renewable energy, electric mobility. There have been announcements for environment protection and forestry. On ground, as from my end, I don't think a lot has happened on the ground. But cynical as I am, comes from the nature of my work. But I want to know it from your view. Against all these headlines that we have made, against all these targets that we have put in, as of now, how strongly can we impose our position based on our achievements? Basically, how much do you think we have achieved? How far are we away, to emphasize that, look, this is what we have done, because it doesn't look good.
So I would actually agree with you. Again, we are looking relatively good in global context because the rest of the world moved backwards and did very little. Plus, there was such a desperate hunger for countries to be projected to claim the mantle of leadership, right? Because who was talking about this in the wilderness years of Trump? The Europeans were talking about it, and the Chinese sort of kind of put their hands up, and they did, bring down renewable energy prices. That's the big contribution they made, with a substantial assist from the Germans, who really paid for it through their feed-in tariff and so on. But really, there was a hesitancy to criticize India because everybody needed some champions. We needed it allowed us to get away with saying renewable energy on the one hand, but coal on the other. Right? So I think we did some good things, and I think things like, for example, the Ujjwala program for gas, the LED lighting program. These are all unambiguously good things. So I don't want to knock our performance too much either. But were we transformative? No. We added a lot of renewable energy capacity. We got a little bit lucky with the prices. But in some areas, like rooftop solar, we didn't add that much. And this is leads me to another point. Everybody says targets work, look at solar. Well, actually, you have two examples in solar. You have grid-connected solar that worked and rooftop solar that didn't. So targets are not sufficient, and they may or may not be necessary. I think we have to unpack what drives it. It was the cost advantage that drove grid-connected solar. So I think that when I talk about these shifts in development pathways around big chunks of the economy and society, my hope is that it will lead us to do more faster and in more transformational ways. So I sort of resist technology-led missions because they are distorting. So rather than an EV mission, we really should be thinking about mobility services, as I said, low carbon mobility services. And that framing really matters in terms of freeing up your imagination, in terms of building a bigger political tent, and so on and so forth. Right? So I guess my answer to your question is I'm hopeful. I hear from people in industry that they're really seized of this as an opportunity. I embrace that language of opportunity. I embrace the language of boldness. I just don't embrace the language of foolhardiness. Right? But I also do not embrace the language that says India's way ahead of the curve. We can sit back on our laurels. We haven't done quite as much to deserve that. Let me just unpack one more thing here. People often cite the Climate Action Tracker, and I know these folks well who run the tracker, and it says India is one of the few countries that is 2 degrees compatible. We may even be close to 1.5, though we're not quite 1.5 degree compatible. There's a little bit of smoke and mirrors here, right? A country can only be compatible with a global target based on some assumptions about what is fair for different countries to do. In other words, you can't be 2 degrees compatible by yourself. You're only 2 degrees compatible based on some underlying allocation of how much each country should do that happens behind the scenes. And how much each country should do is actually the subject of fierce debate. We have a paper that I'm a distant 15th author on or something out actually this week in Nature Climate Change that talks about how the metrics by which you judge whether what a country has done is adequate or not, fair or not. There are multiple such metrics, and they result in very, very different outcomes. So to your point, I don't think we can actually. It is entirely defensible to say we're already well ahead of the curve and we've done a lot. We have a long way to go.
Thank you so much for the fascinating conversation. We really, really appreciate you joining us, and we learned a lot. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sandeep, and thank you, Shreya. I had a lot of fun doing this, and I'm really glad you all have started this podcast, and more luck, success, and years to you.
Thank you so much.
That is.
Thank you. For more information about the podcast, visit us online at www.101reporters.com/podcast/the_India_energy_hour. You can also reach out to us on social media and send us your comments and suggestions. My Twitter handle is @SandeepPai with a double I, and Shreya's Twitter handle is @Shreya_J.